welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be jumping into something, quite interesting, I think. Plato's Gorgias, but specifically part 4 of the Gorgias. And you shared this with us, I'm guessing, because you're interested in this idea of how do we persuade people? How do we communicate effectively? And also, what does it really mean to be superior? What is that?
Yeah, it's something that I think we grapple with all the time, especially in a world where there's so much information and so many voices competing for our attention.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to sort through all of that and figure out what's true, what's valuable, what's worth listening to?
Right. And this is a dialogue from ancient Greece.
Yeah.
But it's so relevant, right? Because we're still dealing with these same questions today. How do we figure out who to trust, who to listen to, and how do we know that we're not just being manipulated by, clever rhetoric?
Absolutely. I mean, this dialogue really gets to the heart of what it means to be a good leader, a good communicator, and even just a good person, right? Because it's not just about winning arguments or being persuasive. It's about something much deeper than that.
Right. And this section of the Gorgias, it jumps into this conversation that's already kind of in progress between Socrates, who obviously most people know Socrates is, and this guy named Callicles, who's been kind of critical of Socrates and how he talks about things, particularly, the difference between nature and convention, which were, this is a key philosophical debate in ancient Greece, and it's still relevant today, right? What's naturally true versus what is just something that we all kind of agree on, like a social norm. But Socrates, he's got bigger fish to fry, right? He's not just trying to win an argument about definitions here. He's trying to get to some deeper truths about what it means to be a good leader and how we should communicate.
Yeah, exactly. I think Socrates often uses these seemingly simple scenarios, these thought experiments, to expose something much more fundamental, these universal truths. And in this case, he starts with this analogy of a group of people who are sharing food and drink, right? And he asks, should the wisest person, maybe a doctor, get a larger portion just because they understand more about, what's beneficial for the body?
And Callicles is immediately like, what? No, that's drivel. He's so offended by this idea, and it's because Callicles has a very different idea of what it means to be superior, right? He's talking about wisdom in public affairs, the ability to govern effectively, and also this manliness to execute those plans, right? It's a key takeaway for us, be wary of arguments built on shifting definitions, right? When someone can't clearly state what their terms mean, their argument crumbles.
It is very interesting, though, how Callicles' definition of what it means to be superior, immediately kind of shifts, right? Yeah. As soon as Socrates points out this, the fact that he previously defined the better and superior as the stronger. And now he's using, wiser and manlier. And so, it really, I think this back and forth really kind of sets the stage for this whole discussion about, what do we actually value? And how does that shape the way we communicate with each other?
Right. And it's almost like Callicles is trying on these different definitions for size, and Socrates with his relentless questioning is just kind of poking holes in all of them. And so right away, you're kind of confronted with this question, what does define superiority? Is it physical strength? Is it intelligence? Is it something else entirely? And this is where I think Socrates' method, while it can be very frustrating to read because it feels like he's going in circles sometimes, but it's so powerful because he's using these extreme examples, like the doctor with the food, to push us beyond our immediate assumptions and consider these universal truths, these fundamental, unchanging principles that Socrates believed could be uncovered through this very rigorous questioning. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about opinions here. He's really aiming for knowledge, something right. that goes beyond that.
And then he brings up this really interesting connection between poetry and rhetoric, which, I think is a really key moment here. He asks Callicles to imagine stripping poetry of all of its musical elements, right? Like the rhythm, the meter, the melody. Mm-hmm. And what's left, he says, is simply speeches delivered to large audiences.
And if it's public speaking, right? If it's a speech delivered to an audience in order to persuade them of something, then it's essentially a type of rhetoric.
Right. And so the point here is that persuasion isn't just about logic.
Right.
It's not just about making a rational argument. There's also this emotional and even artistic dimension to it.
Yeah.
That can be incredibly persuasive. And I think that's something that we see all the time in the world around us, right? Advertising uses this all the time. Right. Propaganda uses this.
Yeah.
And so it really kind of makes you reconsider the power of creative expression, right?
Yeah.
and how it can be used to shape people's opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's fascinating is that then Socrates uses that point to draw this really crucial distinction within rhetoric itself.
Right.
He looks at the kind of rhetoric that is used when addressing the Athenian people or other assemblies. And he asks, do they genuinely aim to improve the citizens, or are they just trying to please them?
Right.
Much like poets who are catering to a diverse audience of, as he says, children and women and men and slaves, as well as free.
So there's this real dividing line here between rhetoric that's basically just flattery, right? It's just telling people what they want to hear, versus a noble rhetoric that's actually focused on making people better, even if the message is kind of challenging or difficult to hear. And, I think this distinction is so important because it really gets to the heart of what it means to be a responsible communicator.
Mm-hmm.
Are you actually serving the best interests of your audience?
Yep.
Or are you just trying to get their approval? And I think that's something that's really important for us to be aware of today, right? Especially with so much information coming at us from all sides,
Yeah.
You got to really think critically about who's saying what and what their agenda might be.
And he really doesn't pull any punches, does he? He challenges Callicles to name even one orator who has ever consistently strived to make the citizens as virtuous as possible, regardless of whether their message was popular. And it's a really tough question, right? It really makes you think, have we ever really seen that kind of truly virtuous communication? And I think, building on this idea of what it means to genuinely influence someone, he takes this really interesting turn.
Yeah, it's he's setting up this ideal of a communicator who really prioritizes the well-being of their audience above all else, even if it means delivering hard truths.
Right. And this leads him to connect this idea of good rhetoric directly to the concept of virtue, which again is something that Callicles has been talking about, right?
Yeah.
But Callicles' definition of virtue is that it's simply satisfying your own and others' desires. But Socrates is no, hold on a second. Not all desires are created equal, right? He's saying that we should only be satisfying the desires that don't make us worse, which implies that there's a specific skill or an art to even figuring out which desires are beneficial and which ones are harmful.
Right. It gets to the deeper question of what is the ultimate purpose of life? What is the good life?
Right.
And how do we even know which path to take? Yeah. And so to really kind of drive this point home about what noble rhetoric actually looks like, Socrates brings in this really powerful analogy of the craftsman. And I'm hoping you can kind of unpack that for us a little bit, because it's a pretty central idea here.
Yeah, sure. So, Socrates' argument is that a good speaker, someone who's actually aiming to improve their audience, they're not just going to be talking aimlessly, right? They're going to have a specific goal in mind, much like any skilled craftsman. And he gives examples painters, builders, doctors.
Right.
Each of these people, they intentionally arrange their work with a particular form and order in mind, right? They choose their materials very carefully. They use specific methods, and they do all of this to achieve a specific outcome, something that's beneficial.
So it's just as a builder would carefully choose and lay bricks to create a sound structure, a virtuous speaker is going to choose their words very carefully in order to build understanding and promote good in their listeners.
Right. So it really emphasizes this idea of intentionality. It's not just about expressing your thoughts, right? It's about strategically using language for a specific purpose. And that purpose is to benefit your audience.
Yeah, it's really about having a vision for what you're trying to create and then using all of your skills and knowledge to bring that vision to life. Right. And it's interesting, too, because, Socrates doesn't explicitly say this, but the commentary that we have on this text points out this kind of subtle connection to this concept that we talk about a lot today, which is the importance of the process. Right. So Socrates is using this craftsman analogy to talk about effective speaking, but it also kind of makes you think about the importance of understanding the how behind anything that we're trying to create or achieve, right? So whether you're crafting a persuasive argument or leading a team effectively, or even just learning a new skill, it's not just about the end result. It's also about paying attention to the process, right? And understanding how you got there.
Absolutely. I mean, it feels like, rhetoric and composition, there's this growing emphasis on understanding and refining the writer's process.
Right.
From the initial spark of an idea to the final polished piece. And the idea is that, if you can improve the journey, then you're going to inevitably improve the destination as well.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Plato's Gorgias, what would you say is the key takeaway here for you?
For me, it's really this fundamental challenge that Socrates lays before us to critically examine the motivations behind all forms of communication. Are we just trying to win an argument? Or are we trying to get something for ourselves? Or is there like a more noble purpose to rhetoric, like a responsibility to use our ability to communicate to actually make the world a better place?
Right. So it's not just about persuasion for persuasion's sake. It's about like, what are you actually trying to achieve with your words? And I think that's so important to remember today, right? When we're constantly bombarded with messages from all sides, we got to really stop and think, like, what is the intention behind this message? And is it something that I actually want to be a part of?
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you wonder, if we take Socrates' examples of these craftspeople, the painters, the builders, the shipwrights, right? In what ways can we view modern communicators, leaders, even people who are just sharing information online as craftspeople who are shaping ideas and really shaping how we understand the world? And what kind of order and system should they be striving for in their work?
That's such a good question, right? Because we are all, in a sense, craftspeople of our own ideas and our own communication. And so it's like, what kind of world do we want to build with our words? And that's something that I think we all need to be thinking about very carefully.
Absolutely. It's a responsibility that we all share.
Well, that was a fascinating deep dive. Thank you for, sharing this text with us and for guiding us through this conversation.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about Socrates.
Yeah, he's a good one to have these kinds of discussions with, even if he's not always the easiest guy to follow.
It definitely keeps you on your toes.
For sure. All right. Well, we'll see you next time on the deep dive.